The BBC is under pressure after its response to allegations of anti-Israel bias raised in a whistleblower's internal report. The memo by Michael Prescott, as published by the Telegraph, included many claims and that BBC management failed to act, despite being alerted to concerns about accuracy and impartiality. The BBC has stated that it's confident in its editorial processes and denies systemic bias. Despite that, the Director General Tim Davie and Deborah Turness, CEO of BBC News, resigned. With me to discuss the issues is Natasha Hausdorff, Legal Director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. Natasha, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you, David. If only the circumstances were better.
Absolutely. Natasha, before we get into the BBC's response to this report, I'd like to hear about your personal experiences dealing with the BBC in your role.
Well, I've had the opportunity to be interviewed on the BBC on a number of occasions as the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. And I have to say that the content of the report that the Telegraph has been breaking was in many respects not news to me. Those exposés chimed, unfortunately, with my own experiences. One key memorable moment takes me back to the 17th of October 2023. Many of our viewers, I'm sure, will recall the Al-Ahli hospital incident, in which immediately the BBC was reporting a breaking news story of an Israeli airstrike on a hospital. I was actually supposed to be on the BBC at that very point in time. I was waiting on the line to be interviewed when I got a call from the deputy editor of the BBC News channel. He said he was very sorry, but they would have to bump me. I think that was the third time that week. But he apologized for having to bump me to run with this rolling coverage, the breaking news of this hospital strike. And I sought to reason with him there and then. I sought to draw out the journalistic approach to reporting news, especially issues that they could not verify. I said that it was now more important than ever that they had me on to deal with what we did know and what we didn't know, because the commentators that they were interviewing at that very moment in time were all calling it an Israeli airstrike. At the same time, I was already looking at reports online that this was, in fact, a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that had fallen short. But I was consistently cut off in my explanations to the deputy editor. He told me he hadn't seen those reports on any of the wires, that they were going with what were credible reports. And when I sought to dial back, the urgency with which they were rushing out this story and highlight the things that we know indeed from previous conflicts, where in 2021, an average of a third of the rockets that Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired towards Israel, in fact, landed in the Gaza Strip. Ultimately, we know that this same thing happened on the 17th of October, but at that point, it was, of course, entirely possible that this rocket could have come from anywhere. There was a point, a particular quote that the Telegraph revealed in this report, which made this assessment. It said claims against Israel seem to be raced to air or online without adequate checks, evidencing either carelessness or a desire to always believe the worst of Israel. Now, David, that quote really chimed with me on the basis of this and other experiences, but this experience in particular. There was no desire to listen to reason. There was no desire to step back and consider what the possible events may have been. It was rushed to air that Israel had struck a hospital, and the consequences of that false reporting, of course, were enormous. There were riots across the Middle East, and for a long time, other news sources were following the BBC's lead in reporting this false story. The frequency with which both Hamas and Palestinian Islamic rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, the practice of Hamas in keeping weapons caches next to schools, hospitals, using, of course, this otherwise civilian infrastructure as part of its terror infrastructure, all of that seemed utterly irrelevant to this desire. It seemed to always believe the worst about Israel. And ultimately, in the context of me seeking to appeal to this deputy editor's journalistic sense of analysis, he put the phone down on me. And that, unfortunately, is reflective of so much of what this report, which has been leaked, reported by the Telegraph, has highlighted. And the real problem, if you ask me, is that this is not a series of mistakes, as the leaders of the BBC, Tim Davie and Deborah Turness in particular, have sought to maintain. This is systemic. This goes to the culture, the attitude of reporting, and it essentially leaves us with the conclusion, which I'm sure many have drawn before now, that the BBC is in fact rotten to the core on its coverage of the Middle East.
Natasha, there was an interesting way in which the BBC appeared to respond to these allegations. Part of it seemed to be that they kind of held their hands up to doctoring the Trump statements on the January the 6th riot day in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. But there seems to be a complete absence in the coverage with regard to Israel itself. What do you make of that? And also, what do you think of Deborah Turness's comment that she doesn't believe there to be institutional bias in the BBC?
I think at this stage, a comment like that is utterly laughable. I also noted that when she was being interviewed going into the BBC building on this issue, and the issue of anti Semitism was raised with respect to the BBC's coverage of Israel, I discerned, at least in the clip that I watched, an eye roll. And I think that that is indicative of the extremely problematic attitude that the BBC seems to have with respect to taking seriously the concerns about its reporting on Israel. One of the key factors that the Telegraph has highlighted is, in fact, in relation to a false story that the BBC ran, I believe it was in April and in June of 2024, with respect to mass graves that were found at both the Nasser and Shifa hospitals. Now, the suggestion by the BBC was that this was demonstrative of Israeli war crimes, that there were bodies there that were found with hands tied behind their backs, and that Israel had sought to cover this up by essentially dumping Palestinian bodies in mass graves. The Telegraph revealed that, in fact, the BBC had knowledge at the time that these graves had nothing to do with Israel. In fact, they existed before Israeli troops had any presence on the ground in these areas, and that the BBC knew that they had been dug by Palestinians, and this was Palestinians disposing of their dead in this fashion. These are most likely individuals who were executed by Hamas. That is common knowledge in the Gaza Strip. We've had footage which is rarely shown on the BBC, I would hasten to add, but footage of Hamas executing their own civilians in this sort of fashion. And the fact that the BBC knew that there were these mass graves in precisely these locations and still reported this story, seeking to paint Israel as the villain, is monstrous, frankly. In all of these cases, there is absolutely no contrition, there is no regret. In fact, if we go back to the Al-Ahli hospital incident, after, of course, it was proven that the BBC were entirely false in their reporting and seeking to pin this on Israel, Jeremy Bowen was specifically asked if he regretted his reporting on that strike, and he said he didn't. He, in fact, sought to justify the claims that he himself made that the building had been entirely flattened by this Israeli airstrike on the basis that he looked at the photos and that was the conclusion that he drew. So there is no regret. And the overwhelming implication, therefore, is that this false reporting will continue. David, I think it's important that we step back for a moment. And of course, this is not just the BBC that is guilty of propagating this false information and frankly, Hamas propaganda on a regular basis, on a frenzied level, I have to say, over the last 2 years. This is unfortunately demonstrative of a great deal of the reporting that comes out of the Middle East. But the reason that the BBC's conduct here is so very problematic is that there is a tax imposed on British residents. Those that watch a television set necessarily have to pay the BBC license fee. But if we think about the wider reporting of the Middle East, this phenomenon of self-censorship, according to what internationally prescribed terrorist organizations dictate, that is not new. And it is known by journalists operating in the region that they cannot report freely from these places. Douglas Murray, a friend and colleague when he was embedded with the IDF in Lebanon, was reporting that the international journalist colleagues that were there with him were very open about the fact that they had to be very careful about what they reported while they were embedded with the IDF because of their colleagues in Beirut and what Hezbollah, another internationally prescribed terrorist organization, would do to them if they said the wrong thing. So this standard acknowledged code almost seems to be pervasive across so-called journalists in the Middle East, that they will not report the truth to the extent that it will upset the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah. And if we think back to previous conflicts in Gaza, there was an instance, I recall, of an international journalist who either bravely or simply out of ignorance, filmed Hamas firing missiles onto Israel from right next door to the hotel that housed all of the international journalists that were in the Gaza Strip at the time. She was out of Gaza that day, as I recall it. She had clearly not received the memo that every other journalist occupying that hotel was in receipt of, because she was the only one that reported on the reality and on the truth. And if we come back to the BBC, I also recall that in previous conflicts, the BBC, as a matter of routine, as a habit, conducted its interviews with senior Hamas figures in the lobby of Al-Shifa hospital. It was common knowledge that these Hamas figures spent their days in the tunnels under that hospital, popped up to the lobby to give an interview to the BBC, and then thereafter disappeared back down into that terror infrastructure, hiding under what would otherwise be a protected building. But that was plainly forgotten in the more recent reporting by the BBC. I mean, all of this points to a deeply, deeply disturbing approach, certainly, to promoting terrorist propaganda and stories that are simply false. And there was an aspect of the Telegraph's reporting, actually, that did trouble me in this. And it was that all of this was put forward with a caveat. You know, whatever your personal views may be on the actions of Israel in Gaza, it was said, whatever your thoughts may be on Israel's actions in Gaza, this, of course, is a very troubling state of affairs. And that struck me, David, because it's necessarily the case that ordinary people's views on Israel's actions in Gaza have been formed on the basis of all of this misreporting. And that's the devastating aspect of what this misinformation has done. It has shaped public opinion on the basis of these falsehoods. And I even recall in the exchange that I had with Jonathan Sumption when he was being interviewed separately about what the International Court of Justice had said in its provisional measures orders in the case that South Africa brings alleging genocide, this heinous false allegation that is being levied at Israel. Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption's analysis of that provisional measures order was of course plainly incorrect. It was demonstrated to be incorrect also by the former president of the International Court of Justice when she was interviewed on this very topic on the BBC on Hard Talk. I think much to the surprise of Jonathan Sacco, who wasn't expecting the answer that he got when he posed that question. But the critical thing here is that Jonathan Sumption was very forthcoming about the fact that he based his opinion on what he was seeing on the BBC. He thought there were terrible war crimes being conducted in Gaza on the basis of what the BBC was reporting. And so all of this false reporting, and there has been an avalanche of it, has been at the centre of all of the false allegations against Israel. And that has necessarily impacted on the false legal analysis that we have had, even from extremely senior individuals like Lord Sumption and of course, Baroness Brenda Hale, who also signed on to this infamous letter to the Prime Minister that put forward this false analysis of the law and the false facts based on, what the BBC and others were reporting.
It takes something like an internal whistleblower's report to get action on these issues, but what really can people like yourself do? What is the role here of UK Lawyers for Israel when something like this is happening?
Well, we know many members and officials at UKLFI have been making consistent complaints. Of course, the complaints process is diabolical. To say it leaves something to be desired is truly an understatement. And my recollection is that the whistleblower also highlighted the fact that appeals were routinely simply dismissed, rather than this important clarifications, issues to do with, casualty figures that were being falsely reported on the basis of Hamas propaganda. Many individual issues have been raised with the BBC, and UK Lawyers for Israel is aware of those. The complaints process on some of them is still ongoing. There are, of course, avenues to pursue, either with Ofcom, and the prospect of judicial review is frequently raised with respect to the BBC and its obligations to report the news with impartiality and with accuracy. But these are extremely high hurdles, and unfortunately, the mechanisms with which to hold the BBC to account are simply not sufficient. That is why we have seen this debacle ensue. And so it's incumbent, I think, on all of us. The Telegraph has been doing excellent work here. It's incumbent upon all of us to highlight these issues, not to let them be papered over. There's a suggestion, and indeed you raised it in your questions, that Tim Davie and Deborah Turness have ultimately been forced to resign because of the way in which the video of President Trump was manipulated. But importantly, all of these problems, all of this false reporting, demonstrably false reporting with respect to Israel, cannot be forgotten, because as a result of this tendency, as this whistleblower has said, to rush these stories to air out of carelessness or a desire to always believe the worst about Israel. I mean, that very much appears to be something that is pervasive throughout the BBC and its reporters, and that will require an awful lot of work to address, if it can be addressed at all.